The silence in Andrew's apartment was deafening on that third day of lockdown. Empty pizza boxes stacked on the coffee table, curtains drawn tight against the world outside, and the weight of isolation pressing down like a physical force. He sat slumped in his recliner, staring at the muted television screen, displaying endless news cycles of uncertainty and fear. The nightmares had gotten worse since the world stopped moving. Combat flashbacks that once visited him weekly now arrived nightly, leaving him gasping for air in sweat-soaked sheets. His therapist's office was closed indefinitely. His few remaining friends had their own families to worry about. The walls of his small apartment felt like they were closing in, suffocating him with memories of battles fought and brothers lost. Something had to change, or he wasn't sure he'd make it. Through another week of this crushing solitude, that's when he remembered the animal shelter's website bookmarked on his laptop, and the idea that had been nagging at him for months suddenly felt like his only lifeline. Please support us by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Andrew Mitchell had served 3 tours as a Special Forces operator, carrying out missions in places whose names remained classified. Years after his honorable discharge, he was the kind of soldier who never talked about his service, not because he wasn't proud, but because the weight of what he'd seen and done was his burden to bear alone. The transition to civilian life had been brutal, without the structure of military discipline and the brotherhood of his unit. Andrew found himself adrift in a world that seemed to move too fast and care too little. The PTSD diagnosis came 2 years after his discharge, followed by a prescription for medication that made him feel like a stranger in his own body. He'd tried group therapy, individual counseling, meditation apps, and even a brief stint with a service dog program that didn't work out when the dog was recalled for additional training. Now, trapped in his apartment during the most isolating time in modern history, Andrew felt the familiar darkness creeping back in. The panic attacks were becoming more frequent, striking without warning and leaving him gasping on the bathroom floor. Sleep brought no relief, only vivid recreations of firefights and the faces of fallen comrades. His savings account was healthy enough from years of military frugality, but money couldn't buy him peace of mind or human connection during a global pandemic. The idea of adopting a dog had surfaced months ago during a particularly difficult therapy session, but he'd always found excuses to avoid following through. Too much responsibility. Too much commitment. What if he couldn't take care of another living being when he could barely take care of himself? But as he scrolled through the animal shelter's website that evening, something shifted inside him. The photograph showed a German shepherd with intelligent amber eyes and a coat that gleamed even through the digital image. Bruno, the listing read, approximately 4 years old. Previous owner surrendered due to personal circumstances. The description mentioned that Bruno had been trained as a therapy dog, but had been returned to the shelter because of his unusual behavioral patterns. The shelter staff noted his exceptional intelligence and his tendency to become agitated around certain people, though they couldn't explain why. Most potential adopters had been put off by reports that Bruno seemed to sense things that others couldn't detect, often becoming restless or protective without apparent cause. The shelter had been caring for Bruno for 3 months, watching as potential families came and went, all ultimately deciding that his intense demeanor and mysterious past made him too much of a risk. But something in those amber eyes spoke to Andrew through the computer screen, a recognition that transcended the digital barrier between them. This was a dog that had been abandoned, just like Andrew felt abandoned by a world that had moved on from the wars he'd fought. This was an animal that had been deemed too difficult, too complicated, too damaged for most people to handle. Andrew understood that feeling intimately. When he called the shelter that evening, his hands trembling slightly as he dialed, the volunteer on the other end seemed surprised by his interest in Bruno. Most people, she explained, were looking for younger, more predictable pets. Bruno required someone with patience, someone who understood that trust had to be earned rather than expected. Andrew found himself nodding along, thinking that Bruno sounded exactly like the kind of companion he needed. The drive to pick up Bruno felt like a mission in itself, the first time Andrew had left his apartment in 5 days. The shelter worker, a kind woman in her 50s named Margaret, walked him through Bruno's routine and quirks. The dog had been found wandering near a medical research facility, she mentioned, though his previous owner's identity remained somewhat mysterious. What struck Andrew immediately was how Bruno seemed to study him, those amber eyes taking in every detail with an intensity that felt almost human. There was no immediate tail wagging or excited jumping that you might expect from a dog meeting his new family. Instead, Bruno approached slowly, deliberately, his nose working overtime as he processed Andrew's scent. When their eyes met, Andrew felt something he hadn't experienced in months, a sense of being truly seen and understood. Bruno seemed to sense the weight Andrew carried, the invisible wounds that no metal or commendation could heal. As Margaret handed over the leash, she mentioned one final detail that would prove more significant than anyone realized at the time. Bruno had an unusual talent for detecting illness in people, often becoming agitated or protective when someone nearby was sick, even before symptoms appeared. Previous owners had found this behavior unsettling, but Andrew found himself intrigued rather than concerned. Here was a dog that had been rejected for the very qualities that made him special, for seeing what others couldn't see. The drive home was quiet. Bruno sitting calmly in the passenger seat, occasionally glancing at Andrew with what seemed like approval. For the first time in weeks, Andrew felt like he wasn't completely alone in the world. The first week together established a routine that neither Andrew nor Bruno had experienced with previous companions. Each morning, Andrew would wake not to the usual surge of anxiety and dread, but to the gentle pressure of Bruno's head resting against his leg. The dog seemed to instinctively know when the nightmares were coming, positioning himself strategically on the bed so that Andrew would feel his warm presence during the worst moments. When panic attacks struck, Bruno would press his full weight against Andrew's chest, providing a grounding sensation that no medication had ever achieved. The dog's presence was like a living anchor, keeping Andrew tethered to the present moment instead of lost in memories of combat zones and fallen friends. But Bruno wasn't just providing emotional support. He was displaying behaviors that Margaret at the shelter had only hinted at. He would pace restlessly near the windows facing north toward Hawthorne Creek, his nostrils flaring as he processed scents that Andrew couldn't detect. Sometimes Bruno would growl low in his throat while staring in that direction, his hackles rising as if responding to some distant threat. Andrew initially attributed this to Bruno adjusting to his new environment, perhaps picking up on wildlife or other dogs in the area. The neighbors in his apartment complex seemed normal enough, a mix of young professionals and retirees living quiet lives in the suburban setting. But Bruno's behavior suggested something more complex was happening, something that went beyond typical canine territorial instincts. During their evening walks, Andrew noticed how Bruno would suddenly stop and test the air, his entire body tensing as if he'd detected something alarming. These moments of heightened alertness always occurred when they walked toward the creek area, making Andrew wonder what his new companion was sensing that remained invisible to human perception. Bruno's extraordinary abilities became undeniable when they encountered Kathy Williams during their second week together. The elderly woman lived alone in a modest house near Hawthorne Creek, her late husband having passed away just before the pandemic began. Andrew had noticed her working in her garden during their walks, always offering a friendly wave, but keeping her distance as health protocols dictated. Bruno, however, had different ideas about social distancing when it came to Kathy. During one of their routine walks, Bruno suddenly broke away from Andrew's side and approached Kathy's fence, whimpering and pawing at the gate with obvious distress. Kathy emerged from her house looking pale and slightly unsteady, apologizing for whatever Bruno might be reacting to. But Bruno wasn't being aggressive or territorial. He was displaying the same protective behavior Andrew had seen during his own panic attacks. The dog pressed against the fence, whimpering softly and refusing to leave despite Andrew's attempts to call him away. Something in Bruno's insistence made Andrew pay closer attention to Kathy's appearance. Her usual rosy complexion looked ashen, and she seemed to be breathing more heavily than a simple walk to the fence should have warranted. When Andrew gently asked if she was feeling all right, Kathy admitted she'd been experiencing some fatigue and a slight cough for the past few days, symptoms she'd attributed to seasonal allergies. But Bruno's behavior suggested something more serious was developing, something that required immediate attention. Andrew found himself offering to help contact her doctor or drive her to urgent care, an offer of assistance that surprised him as much as it did Kathy. For months, he'd been so consumed with his own struggles that reaching out to help someone else felt foreign and uncomfortable. But Bruno's obvious concern for this stranger had awakened something in Andrew that had been dormant since his discharge from the military, a sense of purpose beyond his own survival. The interaction with Kathy marked a turning point in Andrew's recovery that he wouldn't fully understand until much later. With Bruno's encouragement, he began taking a more active role in his neighborhood community. They would check on Kathy daily, with Andrew bringing groceries and supplies, while Bruno performed his mysterious health assessments. The dog's predictions proved remarkably accurate. Kathy's mild symptoms developed into a serious respiratory infection that required hospitalization. The early intervention that Andrew had encouraged, prompted by Bruno's unusual behavior, may have saved her life, according to her doctor. Word spread through the neighborhood about the veteran and his remarkable dog who had helped identify Kathy's illness before it became critical. Soon other neighbors were approaching Andrew during their walks, sharing their own health concerns and asking if Bruno might be able to check them out as well. Andrew felt awkward about these requests initially, not wanting to position Bruno as some kind of medical diagnostic tool. But he couldn't deny what he was witnessing. Bruno consistently showed agitation around people who later developed illnesses, while remaining calm and friendly around those who were healthy. The dog's behavior was becoming impossible to ignore or explain away as coincidence. During one of these neighborhood encounters, Andrew met Gary Thompson, a local police officer who had heard about Bruno's unusual talents. Gary mentioned that the police department had been investigating some suspicious activities near Hawthorne Creek, and he was curious about Andrew's military background and whether he'd noticed anything unusual in the area. The conversation was casual and friendly, but it planted a seed of awareness in Andrew's mind that would soon grow into something much more significant. Gary Thompson proved to be exactly the kind of steady, reliable person that Andrew had been missing from his civilian life. The police officer was a few years younger than Andrew, with the kind of calm competence that came from years of community service. During their conversations, Gary mentioned Dr. Linda Chen, a veterinarian who also conducted research at the nearby University Medical Center. Dr. Chen had been hearing reports about Bruno's diagnostic abilities and was professionally curious about the scientific implications of what Andrew was observing. When she contacted Andrew to request a meeting, he initially hesitated, worried that academic interest might lead to Bruno being taken away for testing or research. But Dr. Chen's approach was gentle and collaborative, focused on understanding rather than exploiting Bruno's gifts. During their first meeting at her clinic, Dr. Chen examined Bruno thoroughly while asking detailed questions about his behavior patterns and previous training. She confirmed that Bruno was in excellent physical health, but noted some unusual neurological responses that suggested heightened sensory processing. Most dogs, she explained, had incredible scenting abilities compared to humans, but Bruno's reactions indicated something beyond normal canine capabilities. Dr. Chen mentioned that she had tried to contact Bruno's previous owner to learn more about his background and training, but the man had been difficult to reach. Oliver Park, she said, had been involved in some kind of medical research before surrendering Bruno to the shelter. The name meant nothing to Andrew at the time, but Dr. Chen's expression suggested there might be more to the story than a simple pet surrender. She asked Andrew to keep detailed notes about Bruno's behavior, particularly his reactions to different people and situations. If Bruno truly possessed some kind of medical detection ability, Dr. Chen wanted to document it properly and perhaps find ways to train other dogs to provide similar services. The possibility that Bruno's talents could help other people appealed to Andrew's desire to serve something larger than himself, a calling he'd been missing since leaving the military. The mystery of Bruno's past began to unravel when Andrew decided to investigate Oliver Park's background more thoroughly. Dr. Chen had provided what little information she had. Oliver was a pharmacist and research scientist who had worked on various medical projects before abruptly leaving the area 6 months earlier. Bruno had been surrendered to the shelter with minimal paperwork, just enough to establish that Oliver was the legal owner and was voluntarily giving up custody. But the more Andrew learned about Oliver, the more questions arose about why such a successful professional would suddenly abandon both his research and his obviously valuable companion. Local business records showed that Oliver had operated a small pharmaceutical consulting firm near Hawthorne Creek, specializing in drug development and testing protocols. His clients had included several major pharmaceutical companies as well as government health agencies, suggesting work that went well beyond simple prescription fulfillment. Neighbors remembered Oliver as a quiet, dedicated professional who often worked late into the night and rarely socialized outside of professional contexts. But they also remembered his obvious devotion to Bruno, taking the dog on long walks and training sessions that seemed more intensive than typical pet care. The sudden departure had surprised everyone who knew them, particularly because Oliver had left no forwarding address and had apparently made no arrangements for continued care of his research projects. When Andrew drove by the address listed for Oliver's former residence, he found an empty cabin near the creek that looked like it had been abandoned in haste. Bruno's reaction to approaching the property was immediate and intense, the dog becoming agitated and pulling toward the building with obvious urgency. Something about this place was calling to Bruno in a way that Andrew couldn't ignore, suggesting that answers about the dog's mysterious past lay waiting inside. The cabin near Hawthorne Creek sat on a secluded lot surrounded by dense woods and accessible only by a narrow dirt road. As Andrew and Bruno approached the building, the dog's excitement became almost overwhelming, his nose working frantically as he processed familiar scents that had been absent from his life for months. The front door was unlocked, suggesting either careless departure or intentional accessibility for someone who might return. Inside, the cabin revealed the true scope of Oliver Park's work and the reason for Bruno's extraordinary abilities. The main living area had been converted into a sophisticated laboratory, complete with medical equipment, computer workstations, and storage cabinets filled with research materials. Charts on the walls showed detailed anatomical diagrams of canine olfactory systems, alongside complex molecular structures and chemical formulas. But it was the discovery of Oliver's personal research notes that revealed the most shocking information about Bruno's background. According to the detailed documentation Andrew found, Bruno hadn't simply developed his diagnostic abilities through natural talent or basic training. He had been part of an experimental program designed to enhance dogs' natural scenting abilities for medical applications. Oliver had been working on a groundbreaking project to train dogs to detect specific protein markers associated with various diseases, potentially revolutionizing early diagnosis and treatment. The research showed that Bruno had been exposed to controlled samples of different pathogens and had learned to identify the unique scent signatures of various illnesses with remarkable accuracy. This explained Bruno's unusual reactions to sick people and his ability to detect health problems before symptoms became obvious to human observers. But the research notes also revealed something more disturbing. Oliver had been under pressure from unknown parties to weaponize this research, to develop diagnostic capabilities for purposes that went far beyond medical treatment. The final entries in Oliver's journal expressed growing concern about the ethical implications of his work and his determination to protect both his research and Bruno from exploitation by people with questionable motives. Hidden behind a loose panel in the laboratory wall, Bruno led Andrew to Oliver's most sensitive materials, encrypted USB drives containing the complete research data, along with evidence that powerful interests had been pressuring Oliver to continue his work, despite his ethical concerns. The USB drives were carefully wrapped and sealed, suggesting Oliver had hidden them as a safeguard against theft or misuse. Among the hidden materials, Andrew found a letter addressed to whoever might eventually find Bruno, explaining Oliver's decision to disappear and entrusting the dog's care to someone who would protect both Bruno and the research from exploitation. The letter revealed that Oliver had been receiving threats from individuals who wanted to use his diagnostic research for purposes that could harm rather than help people. Pharmaceutical companies interested in monopolizing early detection technology, government agencies seeking to develop biological weapon detection capabilities, and criminal organizations looking to exploit medical vulnerabilities had all expressed interest in Oliver's work. Rather than allow his research to be perverted into something harmful, Oliver had chosen to disappear, hoping that Bruno would eventually find a caretaker who could appreciate the dog's gifts without exploiting them. The letter also contained warnings about Marcus Rodriguez, a man who had been particularly persistent in his attempts to acquire Oliver's research through intimidation and bribery. Rodriguez operated a network of illegal pharmaceutical operations, producing counterfeit medications and selling them to desperate patients at inflated prices. He had seen Oliver's research as an opportunity to create fake diagnostic services, charging people enormous fees for fraudulent health assessments while providing worthless or dangerous treatments. Oliver's refusal to cooperate had escalated into direct threats, forcing him to abandon his life's work and disappear for his own safety. As Andrew read these revelations, Bruno pressed close against his side, as if sensing the gravity of what they had discovered. The decision to contact the police about Oliver's research seemed like the right thing to do, but Andrew's military instincts warned him to proceed carefully. He arranged to meet Gary Thompson at a neutral location, bringing copies of some of Oliver's less sensitive documents while keeping the USB drives safely hidden. But as Andrew walked toward the meeting point near the town square, Bruno suddenly froze, his hackles rising as he stared at a group of men lounging near the coffee shop. The dog's behavior was unmistakable. These weren't casual bystanders, but potential threats. Andrew trusted Bruno's instincts completely by now, and he quickly changed direction, leading them away from the planned meeting. His phone buzzed with a text from Gary asking where he was, but something felt wrong about the timing. How had these men known about the meeting? Either Gary had been compromised, or someone had been monitoring their communications. As they hurried back toward Andrew's apartment, Bruno kept looking over his shoulder, his nose working frantically as he tracked scents that spelled danger. Andrew realized they were being followed by at least 2 vehicles, staying just far enough back to avoid detection by anyone without military training. The hunters had become the hunted, and Andrew understood that Oliver's research was valuable enough that people were willing to kill for it. Marcus Rodriguez's network had apparently been watching and waiting for someone to surface with Oliver's work, and Andrew had inadvertently made himself a target by trying to do the right thing. Bruno's extraordinary abilities had saved them from walking into what could have been a deadly trap, but now they needed to disappear before their pursuers could corner them. Going back to the apartment was no longer safe, so Andrew grabbed his emergency bag and headed for the wilderness area around Hawthorne Creek, where he and Bruno had been exploring. His military survival training kicked in as he planned their route through the densest part of the forest, using animal trails and creek beds to mask their passage. But even as they fled, Andrew couldn't stop thinking about the communities they were leaving behind. The people Bruno had been helping with his diagnostic abilities would be left vulnerable without their protection. As if reading his thoughts, Bruno suddenly veered off their escape route toward a small clearing where Andrew could hear voices. Hidden behind a fallen log, they observed a family camping in what appeared to be a makeshift shelter. The parents looked exhausted and frightened, while two young children huddled together under a thin blanket. These weren't recreational campers. They were people who had been displaced and were hiding in the woods for reasons Andrew could only guess at. Bruno's behavior toward the family was immediately concerning. He whimpered softly and pawed at Andrew's arm, the same signals he had shown before identifying illness in other people. One of the children, a girl who couldn't have been more than 6 years old, was sitting quietly while her parents discussed their dwindling supplies. But Bruno's reaction suggested she was fighting something more serious than hunger or cold. Andrew made a decision that went against every survival instinct he possessed. He approached the family to offer help. The parents were initially suspicious of a stranger emerging from the woods, but Andrew's calm demeanor and obvious concern for their welfare gradually won their trust. The little girl, Emma, had been running a low fever for 2 days, but her parents had been afraid to seek medical attention because of their undocumented status. Using knowledge gleaned from Oliver's research notes, Andrew was able to identify signs of a serious bacterial infection that required immediate antibiotic treatment. He shared his own emergency medical supplies and used his phone to help the family contact a clinic that provided care regardless of immigration status. The encounter with Emma's family delayed their escape, but reinforced Andrew's growing understanding of his purpose. Bruno's abilities weren't just scientifically interesting. They were a tool for saving lives in situations where conventional medical care wasn't available. As they continued deeper into the wilderness, Andrew reflected on how drastically his life had changed since adopting Bruno. The dog had not only helped him overcome his own psychological struggles, but had also given him a mission that felt as important as anything he had accomplished in the military. They were moving through increasingly difficult terrain now, following deer paths and creek beds that would be nearly impossible to track. Bruno seemed to know exactly where they were going, leading Andrew toward a destination that remained unclear but felt purposeful. The sounds of pursuit had faded, suggesting they had successfully evaded their immediate hunters, but Andrew knew this was only a temporary reprieve. Marcus Rodriguez's organization had demonstrated both patience and resources, and they wouldn't give up easily on research that could be worth millions of dollars. The afternoon was growing late when they encountered Tommy Vasquez, a young man who appeared to be hiking alone and in distress. He flagged them down from across a small meadow, limping slightly and calling for help. Andrew's first instinct was to assist someone in need, but Bruno's reaction was immediate and aggressive. The dog positioned himself between Andrew and the stranger, growling low in his throat with his fur standing on end. Tommy appeared to be in his early 20s, with the kind of clean-cut appearance that would make him blend in perfectly in any suburban setting. He wore expensive hiking gear that looked barely used, and his distress seemed more performed than genuine. Most telling was Bruno's reaction to Tommy's claimed illness. The dog showed none of the concern he typically displayed around genuinely sick people. Instead, Bruno's body language indicated the presence of a predator masquerading as prey. Andrew trusted his companion's instincts completely and maintained a safe distance while appearing to consider Tommy's request for help. The young man's story had inconsistencies that became more apparent under gentle questioning. He claimed to be a college student on a solo hiking trip, but his gear was too expensive and specialized for a casual outdoorsman. His supposed ankle injury didn't prevent him from standing normally when he thought Andrew wasn't looking. Most suspiciously, he kept glancing toward the tree line as if expecting backup to arrive. Andrew realized this was likely an advance scout for Marcus Rodriguez's organization, positioned to intercept them if they followed the most obvious escape route through the wilderness. Tommy's job was probably to confirm their location and delay them until the main pursuit team could arrive. The young man was skilled at his deception, maintaining his injured hiker persona while subtly trying to gather information about where Andrew and Bruno were heading. He asked seemingly innocent questions about their destination and whether they had encountered other people in the area, clearly fishing for intelligence that could be used to set up an ambush. Andrew played along with the conversation, while Bruno remained alert for any signs of approaching danger. The dog's exceptional senses were tracking scents and sounds that remained invisible to human perception, providing early warning of any threats that might be closing in on their position. The confrontation became inevitable when Tommy made the mistake of reaching into his backpack too quickly, triggering Bruno's protective instincts. The dog launched himself at the young man before Andrew fully understood what was happening, knocking Tommy to the ground and revealing the pistol he had been reaching for. Andrew's military training took over as he secured the weapon and restrained Tommy, who finally dropped his innocent hiker act and began threatening them with the consequences of interfering with Marcus Rodriguez's business. The threats confirmed Andrew's worst fears about the scope and ruthlessness of the organization hunting them. Tommy boasted about the resources at Marcus's disposal, including corrupt law enforcement contacts and professional killers who wouldn't hesitate to eliminate anyone who threatened their operations. But he also revealed crucial intelligence about their pursuit tactics and the fact that they didn't yet know the exact location of Oliver's hidden research data. Bruno's attack had disrupted their communication schedule, buying Andrew and Bruno precious time before Tommy's backup realized something had gone wrong. Using zip ties from his emergency kit, Andrew secured Tommy to a sturdy tree where he would eventually be found by other hikers or park rangers. The young man's expensive communication equipment provided additional intelligence about Marcus's organization, including radio frequencies and code phrases that might prove useful later. Bruno had already identified the direction Tommy's backup was approaching from, his superior senses detecting movement and scents that warned of multiple armed individuals converging on their position. Andrew realized they had only minutes to escape before being surrounded by a much larger and better-equipped force. The deeper wilderness around Hawthorne Creek became their sanctuary as Andrew and Bruno evaded the expanding search. Bruno's tracking abilities worked in reverse now, helping them avoid areas where their pursuers had been active while leading them toward defensible positions with multiple escape routes. Andrew found himself drawing on every survival skill he had learned during his military career, combined with Bruno's extraordinary sensory capabilities to stay ahead of their hunters. During a brief rest in a well-concealed position, Andrew managed to establish secure communication with Dr. Linda Chen using an encrypted messaging app. He shared carefully selected portions of Oliver's research data, enough to demonstrate the revolutionary potential of Bruno's diagnostic abilities without revealing their current location or the full scope of the danger they faced. Dr. Chen's response was immediate and excited. She confirmed that Oliver's work represented a breakthrough that could transform early disease detection and save countless lives. The research showed methods for training dogs to identify specific protein markers associated with various illnesses, potentially creating a network of canine diagnostic assistants that could serve communities with limited access to conventional medical care. But Dr. Chen also expressed concern about the ethical implications of the research and the potential for misuse by unscrupulous individuals or organizations. She urged Andrew to contact federal authorities who could provide protection while ensuring the research was developed responsibly. However, their secure communication was interrupted when Bruno suddenly alerted to approaching danger, his sensitive hearing detecting the sound of vehicles and voices much sooner than Andrew could have noticed them. The fact that Marcus's people had found their general area so quickly suggested they had resources and tracking capabilities that went beyond simple manhunting. Andrew realized they were dealing with a sophisticated criminal organization that might have access to military-grade equipment and personnel. Bruno led Andrew to an old hunting cabin hidden deep in the swampy area near the creek, a structure so weathered and overgrown that it was nearly invisible from more than a few yards away. The cabin had clearly been abandoned for years, but it provided shelter and a defensible position while they planned their next move. Inside, Andrew found evidence that Oliver Park had used this location as a backup hideout during the final weeks before his disappearance. Hidden compartments contained additional research notes, emergency supplies, and most shockingly, Oliver's journal detailing his growing fear of Marcus Rodriguez and the threats that had forced him into hiding. The journal entries painted a picture of a brilliant scientist who had stumbled onto research with enormous potential for good or evil, depending on who controlled it. Oliver had initially been approached by legitimate pharmaceutical companies interested in his diagnostic training methods, but Marcus Rodriguez had quickly inserted himself into the negotiations through a combination of bribery and intimidation. When Oliver refused to provide the research data or continue his work under Marcus's control, the threats had escalated to include violence against both Oliver and Bruno. The final journal entries described Oliver's plan to disappear and hide the research until he could find a way to ensure it would be used ethically. But the journal also contained a devastating revelation. Oliver had discovered that Marcus was not just interested in stealing the research for profit, but was planning to use it as part of a larger scheme to corner the market on diagnostic services while simultaneously selling counterfeit treatments to the patients who would be identified. Bruno's abilities were just one piece of a larger criminal enterprise that exploited people's desperation for medical care. The journal's final entry, dated just days before Oliver's disappearance, expressed his determination to protect both Bruno and the research from falling into the wrong hands, even if it cost him his life. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the cabin, Bruno helped Andrew discover Oliver's final gift, a complete backup of his research data, along with evidence of Marcus Rodriguez's criminal activities and the names of his accomplices in the pharmaceutical fraud scheme. But most important was Oliver's detailed account of his own murder, written in anticipation of his death and hidden where only someone with Bruno's exceptional abilities could find it. Oliver had realized that Marcus would eventually track him down, so he had documented every threat, every attempt at bribery, and every piece of evidence that could be used to bring down the criminal organization. The hidden evidence included recordings of conversations where Marcus explicitly discussed eliminating Oliver and seizing control of the diagnostic research. Oliver's body was buried in a location that only Bruno could find, marked with scent markers that would be undetectable to human searchers, but obvious to the dog who had been his faithful companion. The evidence cache also contained a list of law enforcement contacts who Oliver had verified as trustworthy, along with instructions for safely transferring the research to legitimate authorities. Andrew realized that Oliver had sacrificed his life not just to protect Bruno and the research, but to ensure that Marcus Rodriguez's entire criminal empire was destroyed, enterprise could eventually be exposed and destroyed. The weight of this responsibility was overwhelming, but Andrew also felt a sense of purpose that reminded him of his military service. He and Bruno were no longer just running for their lives. They were carrying forward a mission that could save countless people from medical fraud while ensuring that Bruno's remarkable abilities would be used to help rather than exploit vulnerable populations. The evidence hidden in the cabin gave them the tools they needed to fight back, but first they had to survive long enough to deliver it to the right people. The sound of approaching vehicles shattered the silence around the old hunting cabin as Marcus Rodriguez's men completed their encirclement. Andrew counted at least 6 different engine signatures, suggesting a force large enough to ensure no escape routes remained open. Bruno's hackles rose as he detected the scent signatures of multiple armed individuals positioning themselves around their hideout. Through the grimy cabin windows, Andrew could see the unmistakable silhouette of Marcus Rodriguez himself, a man whose reputation for violence preceded him throughout the underground pharmaceutical trade. Marcus was exactly what Andrew had expected. Well-dressed despite the wilderness setting, carrying himself with the arrogance of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted through intimidation and force. His voice carried clearly through the thin cabin walls as he called out his demands. He wanted the USB drives containing Oliver's research, and he was prepared to demonstrate the consequences of continued resistance. Marcus made his intentions crystal clear. He planned to use Oliver's breakthrough research to create a network of fraudulent diagnostic services, charging desperate patients enormous fees for fake health assessments while selling them counterfeit medications that would worsen their conditions rather than cure them. The research that could save lives in the hands of legitimate medical professionals would become a tool for exploitation and suffering under Marcus's control. Andrew realized that surrendering the research would condemn countless innocent people to financial ruin and medical harm, while continuing to resist would almost certainly result in both his and Bruno's deaths. The choice seemed impossible until Bruno pressed against his side, reminding Andrew that they had advantages their enemies couldn't anticipate. Marcus stepped into the cabin with the confidence of a man who had cornered his prey, flanked by two heavily armed associates who kept their weapons trained on Andrew while scanning the small space for hidden threats. The criminal leader was younger than Andrew had expected, probably in his early 40s, with the kind of expensive grooming that suggested his illegal enterprises were highly profitable. His eyes held the cold calculation of someone who viewed other people as obstacles to be removed rather than human beings deserving of consideration. Marcus spoke with the casual tone of someone discussing a minor business transaction, describing how he had systematically eliminated everyone who had stood between him and Oliver's research. He boasted about the patience he had shown, waiting months for someone to surface with access to the hidden data, rather than simply torturing Oliver's location out of him before his death. The scientist's murder had been carefully planned and executed to look like an accident, Marcus explained with obvious pride in his thoroughness. Oliver had been drugged with one of his own experimental compounds, ensuring that his death would appear to be the result of a laboratory mishap rather than homicide. Marcus had even arranged for Oliver's body to be disposed of in a location where it would never be found, eliminating any possibility of forensic evidence that could link back to him or his organization. But Oliver's final act of defiance, hiding the research where only Bruno could find it, had frustrated Marcus's plans and forced him to expand his operation to include hunting down the dog and anyone who might have gained access to the hidden information. The criminal leader made it clear that Andrew's military background and survival skills had impressed him, but that admiration would not prevent him from eliminating both Andrew and Bruno if they continued to interfere with his business objectives. While Marcus spoke, Bruno remained motionless beside Andrew, but his extraordinary senses were working overtime to map the tactical situation surrounding them. The dog's exceptional olfactory capabilities allowed him to identify the exact positions of all 6 armed men outside the cabin, their emotional states based on stress pheromones, and even their approximate levels of combat readiness based on the chemical signatures of adrenaline and other hormones. Bruno could smell the gun oil and metallic scent of weapons, the synthetic materials of body armor, and the distinct personal odors that would allow him to track each individual even in complete darkness. More importantly, Bruno's enhanced hearing detected subtle sounds that revealed weaknesses in their enemy's positioning. One man was fighting a persistent cough that would mask the sound of movement. Another was shifting his weight restlessly in a way that suggested inexperience with extended surveillance, and a third was positioned too far from his backup to provide mutual support if the situation turned violent. Andrew caught Bruno's subtle signals, understanding that his companion was providing tactical intelligence that could turn the tide of what appeared to be a hopeless situation. Andrew realized that their survival would depend on coordinating Bruno's extraordinary abilities with his own military training to execute a plan that seemed impossible, but might be their only chance of escape. Marcus was still talking, outlining his vision for exploiting Oliver's research, when Andrew made the decision to trust Bruno's assessment of their tactical situation completely. Andrew raised his hands in apparent surrender, speaking in the calm, measured tone he had learned during prisoner of war resistance training. He agreed to provide the USB drives in exchange for safe passage, playing the role of a defeated adversary who had finally accepted the futility of continued resistance. Marcus relaxed slightly at this apparent capitulation, signaling to his men to lower their weapons while maintaining their defensive positions. But Andrew was buying time and maneuvering Marcus into the optimal position for Bruno's attack, using subtle hand signals that he and the dog had developed during their weeks together. Bruno understood that they were executing a coordinated assault plan, his muscles tensing as he prepared to move with the explosive speed that only German shepherds possessed. When Andrew dropped his hand suddenly, Bruno launched himself at Marcus with devastating precision, his powerful jaws clamping down on the criminal's gun arm while his weight knocked the man backward into his associates. The surprise attack created exactly the chaos that Andrew needed to implement the combat tactics that had kept him alive through multiple deployments. He rolled behind the cabin's heavy wooden table as gunfire erupted, using the furniture as cover, while Bruno's continued assault on Marcus prevented the criminal leader from coordinating his men's response. The dog's attack had been perfectly timed to maximize confusion while minimizing Andrew's exposure to hostile fire, demonstrating an understanding of combat tactics that went far beyond normal canine capabilities. Andrew realized that Oliver's training had included more than just medical detection. Bruno had been prepared to function as a military working dog in high-stress combat situations. Bruno maintained his attack on Marcus even as bullets splintered the wood around him, his training and instincts overriding the natural fear that would have sent most animals fleeing from the gunfire. The dog's tactical awareness allowed him to use Marcus's body as a shield while continuing to prevent the criminal leader from bringing his weapon to bear on Andrew. Blood streamed from claw marks on Marcus's arms and face, but Bruno's primary objective was restraint and disruption rather than lethal force. Andrew used the cover provided by Bruno's assault to eliminate the immediate threats posed by Marcus's associates, his special forces training allowing him to engage multiple targets with the kind of precision that only came from years of combat experience. But the confined space of the cabin worked against them as well as for them, limiting Andrew's mobility while concentrating the enemy's firepower in a small area. Bruno took a grazing bullet across his shoulder, but continued fighting, his enhanced senses allowing him to anticipate and avoid more serious injury while maintaining pressure on their primary target. The dog's ability to detect incoming threats through sound and scent gave him reaction times that seemed almost supernatural, dodging shots that Andrew never even saw coming. When the cabin became too dangerous to defend, Andrew signaled Bruno to break off his attack and follow him through the back window in a coordinated withdrawal that left Marcus's remaining men scrambling to reorient their assault. The tactical partnership between the veteran and his extraordinary companion had turned what should have been a massacre into a fighting retreat that kept both of them alive against overwhelming odds. The chase that followed led through the most treacherous terrain around Hawthorne Creek, with Andrew and Bruno using every advantage the swampy landscape could provide against their pursuers. Marcus's men were clearly more comfortable in urban environments than wilderness settings, their expensive equipment and tactical gear becoming liabilities in the thick vegetation and unstable ground near the water. Bruno's enhanced senses allowed him to navigate confidently through areas where visibility was limited and footing was uncertain, leading Andrew along paths that would be nearly impossible for their enemies to follow. The old wooden bridge that crossed the narrowest part of the creek had been built decades earlier and showed obvious signs of structural deterioration. But it represented their best chance of reaching the far shore before Marcus's men could flank them. Andrew tested the bridge's stability carefully before committing their full weight to the crossing, but Marcus appeared on the opposite shore before they could reach safety. The criminal leader had circled around with two of his remaining associates, cutting off their escape route while the rest of his men closed in from behind. Marcus was bleeding heavily from Bruno's attack and clearly furious about the unexpected resistance they had encountered. His threats had escalated from business negotiations to personal revenge, and he made it clear that Andrew and Bruno would pay dearly for the humiliation they had caused him. The standoff on the bridge lasted only seconds before Marcus opened fire with an automatic weapon, his shots chewing through the old wooden structure with devastating effect. The bridge collapsed under the assault, sending Andrew plunging toward water that Bruno's enhanced senses had already identified as contaminated with dangerous bacteria and chemical pollutants from decades of industrial runoff upstream. Andrew hit the water hard, the impact stunning him momentarily, while the weight of his gear threatened to drag him beneath the surface. The creek was deeper than it appeared from above, and the current was stronger than he had anticipated. Worse, Bruno's warnings about contamination were immediately validated as the polluted water burned Andrew's eyes and throat, making it difficult to orient himself or swim effectively toward shore. Bruno didn't hesitate before launching himself from the collapsing bridge, despite his own injury and the obvious danger posed by the contaminated water. The dog's loyalty overrode every survival instinct as he swam powerfully toward Andrew, using his superior swimming ability and uninjured limbs to compensate for his wounded shoulder. Marcus continued firing from the shore, his bullets sending up geysers of polluted water around both swimmer and rescuer, while his men attempted to find positions that would allow them to finish off their targets. Bruno reached Andrew just as the current swept them both toward a tangle of fallen trees that could have trapped them beneath the surface, using his powerful jaws to grip Andrew's jacket and haul him toward a partially submerged log that provided temporary shelter from Marcus's gunfire. The dog's swimming strength and determination kept both of them afloat, while Andrew recovered enough to assist in their escape. But the contaminated water was already affecting both of them in ways that would prove nearly fatal. Salvation came from an unexpected source as Kathy Williams emerged from the tree line behind Marcus's position, moving with the fluid precision of someone whose frail, elderly appearance had been an elaborate deception. Andrew recognized immediately that her stumbling, helpless neighbor persona had been a carefully maintained cover identity designed to deflect attention from her true capabilities. Kathy moved like the professional she had once been, using suppressed weapons and tactical equipment that appeared from concealed positions around Marcus's men with devastating efficiency. Her assault was coordinated with the arrival of Gary Thompson and a specialized law enforcement team that had been tracking Marcus's organization for months. Kathy had been working undercover to identify and document the criminal network's activities, using her position in the neighborhood to monitor their operations while gathering evidence for federal prosecutors. Gary's earlier meeting with Andrew had been compromised, not by corruption, but by the complex requirements of an ongoing investigation that couldn't risk exposure until all the key players had been identified and located. Bruno's exceptional senses had detected the deception in Gary's behavior, but not the underlying reason for it, leading to misunderstandings that had nearly proven fatal for everyone involved. The coordinated assault eliminated Marcus's remaining associates with professional efficiency, leaving the criminal leader isolated and wounded on the creek bank with no possibility of escape. Bruno used his remaining strength to guide the rescue team to Andrew's location in the water. His ability to detect human scent even through the chemical contamination, allowing him to serve as a living beacon for the emergency response personnel. The final confrontation took place on the muddy shore of Hawthorne Creek, with Marcus Rodriguez cornered but still armed and desperate enough to fight to the death rather than face capture and life imprisonment. His automatic rifle had been damaged during the bridge collapse, but he still possessed a sidearm and the kind of desperate courage that made wounded predators most dangerous. Marcus knew that federal prosecutors had enough evidence to ensure multiple life sentences, and he seemed determined to inflict as much damage as possible before his inevitable death or capture. He kept his weapon trained on the rescue team while shouting demands for safe passage that everyone knew would never be granted. His threats focused particularly on Bruno, whom he blamed for the failure of his carefully planned operation to seize Oliver's research. Marcus had invested enormous resources in tracking down and eliminating everyone connected to the diagnostic research, and Bruno represented the last obstacle to achieving his goals. The dog was barely conscious from his injuries and exposure to contaminated water, but Marcus seemed determined to kill him as a final act of spite against the forces that had destroyed his criminal empire. Andrew positioned himself between Marcus and Bruno, despite his own injuries, drawing on reserves of strength and determination that reminded him of the most desperate moments during his military service. The standoff seemed likely to end in tragedy until Bruno summoned enough strength for one final display of the tactical intelligence that had kept them alive throughout their ordeal. Despite his injuries and disorientation from the contaminated water, Bruno managed to time his final attack with the precision that had characterized all his actions throughout their partnership. The dog waited until Marcus's attention was focused on the negotiations with law enforcement, then launched himself at the criminal's gun arm with the last of his strength. Bruno's attack knocked Marcus off balance just as Gary Thompson and his team moved to secure the area, the perfectly coordinated assault eliminating the final threat to everyone's safety. Marcus went down hard, his weapon discharged harmlessly into the mud as Bruno's teeth found their target with devastating accuracy. Andrew reached his companion just as Bruno collapsed from exhaustion and the effects of his exposure to the contaminated water. The dog's breathing labored and irregular as his body struggled to process the toxins he had absorbed during the rescue. Marcus Rodriguez was taken into custody alive but severely injured, his criminal empire dismantled and his associates either dead or in federal custody awaiting trial. The USB drives containing Oliver's research were secured and transferred to legitimate authorities who could ensure the diagnostic techniques would be developed responsibly for medical rather than criminal purposes. But Andrew's attention was focused entirely on Bruno, whose heroic actions had saved multiple lives while exposing him to potentially fatal contamination. The dog's enhanced senses, which had been their salvation throughout the ordeal, were now working against him as his nervous system struggled to process the overwhelming input from the toxic chemicals in his bloodstream. Dr. Linda Chen arrived on scene within minutes of the all-clear signal, her emergency veterinary equipment already prepared for the kind of chemical exposure that Bruno had suffered. She had been monitoring the law enforcement operation from a mobile command post, ready to provide immediate medical care for the dog whose abilities had made the entire investigation possible. Bruno's condition was critical, but not hopeless, his enhanced physiology giving him advantages in processing toxins that normal dogs would not possess. Dr. Chen's treatment focused on supporting Bruno's natural detoxification systems while preventing the neurological damage that could rob him of the enhanced senses that made him so extraordinary. Andrew refused to leave Bruno's side during the emergency treatment, his own injuries forgotten in his concern for the companion who had saved his life multiple times during their ordeal. The helicopter evacuation to the specialized veterinary hospital was complicated by weather conditions and the remote location, but Bruno's condition remained stable throughout the flight, thanks to Dr. Chen's expert care. Andrew found himself praying for the first time since his military service, asking whatever force might be listening to spare the life of the dog who had given him purpose and hope when he had neither. The bond between veteran and companion had deepened through shared danger into something that transcended normal human-animal relationships, a partnership forged in combat and tested by the kind of extreme circumstances that revealed true character. The emergency surgery lasted 6 hours, with Dr. Chen and her team working to repair the damage from Bruno's bullet wound while simultaneously treating the chemical poisoning that threatened his enhanced nervous system. Andrew maintained his vigil in the hospital waiting room, surrounded by the neighbors and community members whose lives had been touched by Bruno's diagnostic abilities. Kathy Williams, whose true identity as a federal agent had been revealed during the arrests, explained how Bruno's detection of her fabricated illness had actually helped maintain her cover identity while allowing her to monitor the investigation's progress. The dog's abilities had been both more and less than they appeared. His medical detection capabilities were genuine and extraordinary, but Kathy's supposed illness had been a performance designed to test Bruno's reactions and Andrew's trustworthiness as a potential ally in the operation against Marcus Rodriguez. The revelation that their first encounter had been orchestrated rather than accidental didn't diminish the real help that Andrew and Bruno had provided to other community members, whose genuine medical emergencies had been identified and treated thanks to Bruno's abilities. Dr. Chen emerged from the operating room exhausted, but optimistic, reporting that Bruno's surgery had been successful, and his enhanced senses appeared to be intact despite the trauma he had endured. The dog's recovery would be lengthy and uncertain, but his vital signs were strong, and his neurological responses suggested that his extraordinary abilities had not been permanently damaged by his exposure to the contaminated water. Bruno's awakening marked a turning point, not just in his recovery, but in Andrew's understanding of their partnership and its implications for the future. The dog's first action upon regaining consciousness was to seek out Andrew's presence, his enhanced senses confirming that his human companion was safe and unharmed despite everything they had endured together. Andrew's emotional response to Bruno's recovery surprised him with its intensity, tears of relief and gratitude flowing freely as he realized how much his identity and sense of purpose had become intertwined with his relationship to the remarkable dog. Dr. Chen confirmed that Bruno's diagnostic abilities were not only intact, but potentially enhanced by his recovery experience, his nervous system having adapted to the toxin exposure in ways that might actually improve his sensitivity to disease markers in humans. The USB drives recovered from Oliver's hiding places contained research data that validated everything Andrew had observed about Bruno's capabilities, along with training protocols that could be used to develop similar abilities in other dogs. Federal investigators confirmed that the evidence would be sufficient to dismantle Marcus Rodriguez's entire criminal network, with prosecutions extending to corrupt officials and pharmaceutical executives who had collaborated in the fraudulent diagnostic and treatment schemes. Oliver Park was posthumously awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom for his sacrifice in protecting research that could revolutionize medical diagnostics while refusing to allow it to be perverted for criminal purposes. The ceremony honoring Oliver's memory also recognized Andrew and Bruno as heroes whose courage and determination had ensured that a dangerous criminal organization was brought to justice while protecting innocent lives from exploitation. The community celebration that followed their recovery brought together everyone whose lives had been touched by Andrew and Bruno's partnership, from the families they had helped during their flight through the wilderness to the neighbors who had benefited from Bruno's diagnostic abilities. Kathy Williams, whose real name was Agent Catherine Morrison, expressed the federal government's gratitude for their cooperation while acknowledging the deception that had been necessary to protect the investigation's integrity. Gary Thompson was commended for his role in coordinating the law enforcement response that had ultimately saved Andrew and Bruno's lives while ensuring Marcus Rodriguez's capture. Dr. Linda Chen announced plans to establish a research foundation dedicated to developing Oliver's diagnostic techniques for widespread medical use, with Bruno serving as the primary subject for ongoing studies that would unlock the full potential of canine medical detection. The foundation would also train other dogs and handlers, creating a network of diagnostic teams that could serve communities with limited access to conventional medical care. Bruno's role would transition from that of a fugitive survivor to a teacher and ambassador for the revolutionary medical techniques that his extraordinary abilities represented. Andrew found himself offered positions with both federal law enforcement agencies and private medical research organizations, all eager to benefit from his unique experience and partnership with Bruno. But his decision about the future would be guided by what was best for Bruno rather than his own career advancement, their bond having transcended normal considerations of personal benefit or professional achievement. The return to their home near Hawthorne Creek marked the beginning of a new chapter that neither Andrew nor Bruno could have imagined during those first desperate days of lockdown. The small apartment that had once felt like a prison now served as headquarters for their expanded mission of community service and healing. Bruno's recovery had been remarkable, his enhanced senses not only intact, but seemingly strengthened by their shared ordeal. The dog's ability to detect early signs of illness had become even more refined, allowing him to identify health problems with an accuracy that continued to amaze medical professionals. Kathy Williams, whose real name was Agent Catherine Morrison, had chosen to retire from federal service and remain in the community where her cover identity had become genuine friendship. The three of them formed an unlikely but effective team, with Kathy's investigative skills complementing Andrew's military experience and Bruno's extraordinary diagnostic abilities. Their daily routines now included regular wellness checks throughout the neighborhood, with Bruno serving as an early warning system for medical emergencies that might otherwise go undetected until they became critical. The elderly residents who had initially been curious about Bruno's abilities had become his most devoted supporters, understanding that his presence in their community represented a level of healthcare monitoring that was unavailable anywhere else in the country. Andrew found himself serving as an informal coordinator for these activities, his apartment transformed into a command center where residents could report concerns and schedule appointments for Bruno's assessments. The transformation from isolated veteran struggling with PTSD to community leader had happened so gradually that Andrew barely noticed it until Kathy pointed out how dramatically his life had changed since that first decision to adopt a dog during lockdown. The establishment of the Hawthorne Creek Detection and Therapy Center represented the formalization of what Andrew and Bruno had been doing informally for months. Dr. Linda Chen had secured federal funding for the facility, which occupied a converted warehouse near the creek that provided ample space for training areas, medical equipment, and housing for the growing number of dogs entering the program. Bruno's role as the primary trainer and mentor for incoming dogs had revealed yet another dimension of his extraordinary intelligence, his ability to communicate complex concepts to other canines through demonstrations and behavioral modeling. Andrew served as the center's director, overseeing a staff that included veterinarians, dog trainers, and medical researchers who were working to unlock the secrets of enhanced canine diagnostics. The first class of dogs to complete the training program had shown remarkable success rates, with several achieving diagnostic accuracy that rivaled conventional medical testing in specific disease categories. Families throughout the region had begun traveling to Hawthorne Creek to have their dogs evaluated for the enhanced training program, hoping to develop similar capabilities in their own pets. The waiting list for services had grown so long that Andrew was forced to expand the facility twice during its first year of operation, with plans for additional locations already in development. Bruno's daily schedule included training sessions with new dogs, diagnostic assessments for community members, and research activities that continued to advance understanding of how canine senses could be enhanced and focused for medical applications. The success stories were mounting steadily. Children whose serious illnesses had been detected months before symptoms appeared, adults whose early-stage cancers had been identified in time for successful treatment, and families whose lives had been saved by Bruno's remarkable abilities and the growing network of dogs trained in his methods. The most profound changes were not in the external success of their mission, but in Andrew's internal transformation from a man haunted by his military service to someone who had found peace through purpose. The nightmares that had plagued him for years had gradually diminished as his days became filled with meaningful work that helped others rather than destroyed them. Bruno's constant presence provided not just emotional support, but a living reminder that healing was possible even after the most traumatic experiences. The dog's own recovery from near-fatal poisoning had demonstrated resilience that inspired Andrew's own psychological healing, showing him that survival was only the first step in a process that could lead to growth and renewed purpose. Their partnership had evolved from mutual dependence to collaborative strength, each contributing unique abilities to their shared mission of service. Andrew's military training provided organizational skills and tactical thinking that proved invaluable in developing efficient systems for diagnostic screening and emergency response. Bruno's enhanced senses provided the core capability that made their work possible, but it was their relationship that transformed individual abilities into something greater than the sum of its parts. The community that had formed around their work included families from dozens of states, researchers from major universities, and government officials who were working to implement similar programs in other regions. Andrew realized that his decision to adopt Bruno during those dark days of lockdown had not only saved his own life, but had initiated a chain of events that was saving countless other lives as well. As Andrew reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with a simple desire for companionship during lockdown, he understood that the most important lessons had come not from the dramatic confrontations with criminals, but from the quiet moments of daily service to his community. Bruno had taught him that true courage was not just the ability to face enemy fire or survive life-threatening situations, but the willingness to trust, to love, and to open yourself to relationships that could transform your understanding of what it meant to be alive. The dog's loyalty had never wavered, even when facing death on multiple occasions, demonstrating a kind of faithfulness that Andrew had thought existed only in stories and legends. Their partnership had shown him that healing was possible not through isolation and self-protection, but through connection and service to others. The research they had recovered from Oliver Park was revolutionizing medical diagnostics, with clinical trials showing success rates that exceeded all expectations for early disease detection. But the real revolution was happening in communities like theirs, where the bond between humans and dogs was creating new possibilities for health, healing, and hope. Andrew often thought about Oliver's sacrifice and how the scientist's dedication to protecting his research had ultimately ensured that Bruno's abilities would be used to help rather than exploit vulnerable people. The circle of sacrifice and service that connected Oliver, Bruno, Andrew, and now dozens of other dogs and handlers represented something larger than any individual story of survival or heroism. Sometimes the most faithful friends come from our darkest moments, and true courage is shown not only on battlefields, but in the daily choice to trust, love, and help others, even when we ourselves are struggling to survive. The impact of their work continued to expand as word spread about the remarkable diagnostic capabilities being developed at Hawthorne Creek. Medical journals were publishing papers about Bruno's abilities, and veterinary schools were incorporating enhanced diagnostic training into their curricula. But for Andrew, the most meaningful moments were the quiet ones. Watching Bruno work with a new dog, seeing a family's relief when a health problem was detected early enough for successful treatment, or simply sitting by the creek in the evening with his extraordinary companion. The center had become a pilgrimage destination for people seeking hope, healing, and the kind of faithful friendship that could survive any crisis. Bruno's story had touched millions of people through media coverage and documentary films, but he remained the same loyal, intelligent, and loving dog who had rescued Andrew from his darkest hours. Their daily routine still included walks along Hawthorne Creek, though now they were often accompanied by other dogs in training and families who had come to witness the remarkable partnership that had started with a simple adoption during pandemic lockdown. Type Hero Bruno in the comments if you believe loyalty like this still exists, and tell us about the most faithful friend who ever saved you from your darkest moment. Was it a pet, a family member, or maybe a complete stranger? We read every single comment, and your story might be featured in our next video. Stories like Bruno's remind us that even in our most desperate hours, hope can arrive in unexpected forms, often requiring nothing more than our willingness to open our hearts to the possibility that we are not meant to face our challenges alone. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss these incredible stories of friendship between veterans and their four-legged companions who prove that love, loyalty, and courage can overcome even the most impossible odds. Click on the next video now appearing on your screen to hear more heroic stories just like this one. And remember to share this story with anyone who needs to be reminded that faithful friends still exist in this world. We want to thank all the veterans and their families for their sacrifice in service to our country, and to the medical professionals who saved Bruno's life and continue Oliver's groundbreaking research that will help save countless lives in the years to come.